Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside Dave Corbin. Glad to have you with us to explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020 vision.
How's it going, Dave?
Going well, Matt. How about yourself? It's June 1st. Hard to believe that we're into the summer.
I know.
We, as you know, have a wedding in early July, not
Yeah.
July 4th, but close. And it kind of parallels are going through the series, which we've got four straight episodes today, which is a Monday recording on the 1st, and then 8th, 15th, and 22nd. So we'll be a couple weeks ahead of the celebration on July 4th. But yeah, looking forward to the summer and going through these last four sets of writings. We were talking off air before we got into the podcast today, and today we covered John Adams' Thoughts on Government, which is one of my favorite pieces from over 200 years ago. It's just amazing how clear his thought is, and
hmm
how accessible it is as well. So hopefully we can make it that much more accessible in our conversation on the piece.
Yeah, there's so much there. And it really, for April 1776, it really previews so much that's going to come in, the Federalist and a lot of the debates around the Constitution. So yeah, you really see Adams, still a relatively young man, 41 years old at this point, laying out some key principles. And yeah, I mean, it's fun to be at this point now. As you said, we got four episodes in a row, and we're in the middle of this series of patriotic holidays. I don't know if I really noticed that until a year or two ago, but you go, well, Patriots Day in April, and then you've got
Yeah,
Armed Forces Day, Memorial Day, anniversary of D-Day, Flag
yeah.
Day, Juneteenth, Independence Day. So some of those are holidays in terms of days off, and others are just days you mark. But yeah, there's like this nice run of 2 months basically of remembering key people and events from American history, and so it's fun for us to be running through this history at the same time.
Exactly.
Well, let's set a little historical context here. So last time you recall, we were looking at Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and that was first published in January of 1776 and then republished with an appendix filling out some responses to concerns people had raised a month later. We're going to start the story today a little before that, actually. So December 22nd, 1775, Parliament passed a law called the Prohibitory Act. And you'll remember that in August, the king basically said America was in rebellion and called upon the people of America and Britain to act accordingly. And if you were a loyal subject, whether in America or in Britain, your job was to be very plain about that loyalty and to report on anybody that was acting contrary to the interests of the crown, etc. So the Parliament takes notice of that, and of course the events intervening, and in December of 1775 passes this law which cuts off trade with the United States or the American colonies and institutes a blockade on American ports, which, as we all know, is a fundamental act of war, right? And so this is drawing a line, and it's really the kind of thing you're only supposed to be able to do when you have a foreign country. So this was part of the discussion in the Civil War early on. Lincoln, can we blockade the South? What are we doing there? Is that a de facto acknowledgement that the South is its own country? Lincoln doesn't want to do that. And so here the same kind of thing is happening. Well, discerning Americans like Adams say, okay, so in essence, you're saying that we're out of your protection. And so at that point, north to south, local colonies start to organize assemblies to create constitutions. And so January 5th, 1776, long before independence is officially declared for the colonies as a whole, the people of New Hampshire gather in the town of Exeter and approve the first state constitution, colony constitution, whatever you want to call it, but the first constitution coming out of that period.
So, question for you, Matt, and because I know you know a lot about constitutional history, would this have been a normal thing for people to be thinking about, the colonies to be thinking about in the 1770s? So, said differently, how ordinary was it to say, okay, we need a constitution or we need a new charter or whatever it may be?
Well, they did have charters, and they had, you can go back and you can look at the original William Penn Constitution, if you will, for Pennsylvania, and there were several revisions of that, and you could find other colonial examples of that. So it wasn't like it was an entirely new practice for them to think on those terms, but to do that sort of top down, to think about executive authority in addition to legislative authority, and to think about this as really part of an independent posture, right? Separating itself from the lines of accountability you'd had before. That was the new thought. And so, I think it's really a reaction to their interpretation of this act of December, and of course the events surrounding that. The Hessians are on their way. The British are hiring mercenary troops to subdue America. I mean, they're acting like there's a war between two competing countries. And so Americans are starting to say, okay, we better not pretend it's otherwise. And even though they're not ready collectively to declare independence just yet, individual organizations at the state and county level are saying, okay, no, it's time for us to do things. So South Carolina in March adopts a state constitution. And then over the course of 1776, Virginia, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina are all going to follow. And it'll take a few years for all of the colonies to adopt, our states to adopt constitutions, but that process begins in earnest in early 1776. So I mention all that because Adams' thoughts on government, this essay, is not actually about a national government. There's some mention of that later in the essay, but the primary focus is what would it look like if we framed a constitution for Massachusetts? And as it turns out, 4 years later, when they actually do that, he's the principal author. So these ideas eventually get translated into action as part of a broader series of events, or, assembly, sign off, and etc. So it's not just Adams framing a constitution for the state, but his ideas become central to the thinking behind it. And other states follow that model. In fact, New Hampshire revised its constitution very much along the lines of the Massachusetts Constitution in 1784. So Adams is a key figure here in this early constitution building, not at the national level just yet, but at the state level. And so his thoughts on government are really meant to help us understand where was that thinking? What was the most advanced colonial thought in this period about how state governments should be organized and the balance of powers and all the different kinds of things that would become very familiar to us in our later study of the Constitutional Convention and debates around that. We see that beginning to emerge here in the spring of 1776.
Yeah, we've been foreshadowing this pivot in these 13 years leading up to the writing of the Declaration of Independence by suggesting that there's not simply a critique of how the British are administering the colonies, but there's also kind of a thinking forward to, what does the ideal or optimal look like in terms of just governance? But I think it's interesting here that this pivot really kind of marks out, and I know it's at the state level, not the national level, but really the beginning of what would be a 13, 14 year period of what we call the founding fathers actually doing the founding,
Hmm.
right? Kind of laying the foundation. So I think one of the things that we've argued over the last 3 months in covering the series is that there's a theoretical foundation to America's Declaration of Independence. It's not simply based upon ideas that are abstract. It's based upon events that are taking place on the ground. But it's this interplay between thought and practice that really in this new stage of affairs requires the founders to think through, okay, we may declare our independence from Great Britain. What would it look like to establish a new government
Hmm.
on this basis? And I think it's also very interesting that, as you mentioned, he's thinking about the state of Massachusetts, but there's so many principles in play here in terms of lowercase r republicanism that, of course, are going to carry forward two discussions as to what the national government would look like or the federal government would look like as well. So let's
Right.
get into this thoughts on government. I think it's really interesting. At the beginning of the essay, he references the poet Alexander Pope, and who writes, "For forms of government let fools contest, that which is best administered is best." And then replies to that short quote by saying, "Nothing can be more fallacious than this, but poets read history to collect flowers, not fruits. They attend to fanciful images, not the effects of social institutions." There's something very powerful in Pope's statement arguing that the best form of government is that which is administered best. And you see this a lot kind of in the, managerial culture of today. What's a good administration? Well, that one that's administered best.
Hmm.
And Adams is going to shift the whole conversation and say, no, no, no. It's not about that which is administered best. It's that about which produces the best end result. And in an age where we kind of stay away from politics or believe that it's a dishonorable thing, he actually says that at the beginning of the essay that what we're talking about when we're talking about politics is we're talking about a divine science. We're talking about the science of social happiness and talks about the blessings granted to to society when constitutions are ordered rightly. This is very, very different, Matt, isn't it? From even
Hmm.
from today, we don't think about politics as a divine science. We don't think about it as the science of social happiness. We think about politicians as being out for their own good, maybe administering things good here or there, but at the end of the day, making sure that their administration benefits their person rather than the common good of society at large. What do you make of this opening by Adams?
Yeah, their person, maybe their people, right? Maybe they've got a partisan concern or a group of, rabid fans that they're trying to please and keep pleased. But yeah, I mean, I think Adams is really giving us an older understanding of politics and to say what matters in politics is human happiness. I mean, this is what we're talking about. And obviously, in some ultimate sense, happiness is only available through Christ and through a right relationship with God. But here we see something in terms of just the common grace realities of life on the ground. And while we toil on the earth, right, whether governments are good or bad makes a big difference in terms of whether people are likely to be prosperous and free and enjoy good relations with their neighbors. And so, it can't be enough to say, well, if we can just get the right scientific class of technocrats in there making the right decisions, who cares about the details? No, Adam says, look, there are certain kinds of government that mesh with human nature better than others and are grounded in the nature of who we are in the world in which we live in such a way that are likely to produce better results that don't depend upon having that enlightened despot or that great graduating class of Harvard and Yale and Princeton pulling all the right levers, but actually encourage through institutional structure and design better outcomes than you would otherwise get.
So the happiness of society ought to be, or is the end of government in Adams' wording. What is the fountainhead of happiness? What's the fountainhead of human dignity? And here Adams answers in one word, virtue.
Hmm.
Virtue is necessary for there to be human flourishing. And he goes through some other bases upon which governments are founded. He says fear is the foundation of most governments, but it is so sordid and brutal a passion and renders men in whose breasts it predominates so stupid and miserable that Americans will not be likely to approve of any political institution which is founded on it. So don't use fear as the basis of your government. Honor, he mentions, is truly sacred, but it holds a lower rank in the scale of moral excellence than virtue. Indeed, the former is but a part of the latter, and consequently has not equal pretensions to support a frame of government productive of human happiness. But at the end of the day, not fear, not honor. Here you think Thucydides and other historians who've taken a look at the foundations of regimes that
Hmm.
are on that basis, but virtue. Now, not just any type of virtue, but a virtue proper to, as you pointed out earlier, the nature of Americans at that time at the end of the 18th century. A Republican virtue, a lowercase r Republican virtue that he encapsulates in this very important line. The very definition of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men. What's the difference between an empire of laws and an empire of men, Matt?
Well, an empire of men depends upon the individual judgment and arbitrary exercise of power by those who happen to possess power at any given point in time. So it's literally based upon individuals and not reliable in that way. It puts much trust in the goodness and virtue of people who happen to hold the levers of power at any given moment, and likely in practice leads to back and forth swings, dramatic swings between this policy and that policy, between this end and that end, as different individuals take their part. An empire of laws is based upon the notion that we ought to have standing rules that are settled judgments that we deliberate upon, that set policy for all people alike and are consistently applied over the course of time, that are revised in the light of experience and further reflections upon wisdom, but only in an orderly way, in a way that's prospective, that looks forward rather than looking back, so that each person can properly understand their relationship with the government and their relation with their neighbor, and therefore live at peace with both and pursue prosperity, happiness, justice, goodness, and all the rest of the common virtues we seek together.
And there's a parallel here between what Adams calls the empire of men and the three degraded regimes that Aristotle had, and we've referenced in our coverage of Aristotle in the past, those regimes in which the one, the tyrant, the few, the oligarchs, or the many, kind of a radical democracy, set up government for their own advantage rather than the common good. And here Adams takes Aristotle's lead in many ways by suggesting that the two most primary players in any government are the few and the many. And you have to figure out a way in which the few and the many can join together in a collaborative relationship that is to the benefit of the common good. So
Mhm.
here he writes that as good government is an empire of laws, how shall your laws be made? In a large society inhabiting an extensive country, it is impossible that the whole should assemble to make laws. So you can't have the many assemble and make laws. The first necessary step then is to depute power from the many to a few of the most wise and good. So here we're beginning to see kind of the architecture, not only of Massachusetts state government, but what would be the federal government. Allow the many a voice to have representation among the few. Allow the many to choose based upon a set of qualifications in which those people who are going to lead, right, and have the privilege of leading, lead others as they would be led.
Yeah, the challenge here is how do you create a checkbox for wise and good, right? This is going to lead us, I think, into further parts of this conversation where you understand this is really dependent upon the character of the people and the character of their would-be leaders. Because we can say you have to be 35 years old to be president, and you have to be a natural born citizen, and you have to have lived in the United States for a certain number of years, right? All the things that we have in the Constitution, various offices. But what do we say? Well, and you must also be wise, and you must also be good, right? So we need people to have some measure of self-judgment for candidates, a sense of shame, perhaps, if they violate the principles of goodness, or if they show a lack of wisdom to say, you know what, I guess I'm not suited for this office. And we need a people that's looking for that. We need to educate the people so that as they vote, as they discern candidates, as they choose to support this candidate, not that candidate, they're thinking about who's wise and who's good rather than other things that might easily get in the way of their judgment.
Well, the second question he brings up here is if you're going to assemble representatives, do you have a single assembly or do you have multiple assemblies? And Adams argues that if out of this consent and out of this kind of process toward representation, that you produce a single assembly. That single assembly, he argues, is liable to all the vices, follies, and frailties of an individual. And I want to take a step back here because when you look at American politics in the year
Mhm.
2026, do we have multiple assemblies? Do we have office holders who care about their office? Or is American politics in our age really kind of this battling over this single assembly, right? And the single assembly is just kind of this war over words between different ideological factions. So
Mhm.
that, yeah, okay, agreed. We do have institutions. We do have an executive. We do have the Supreme Court. We do have a lower and upper house in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. But in many ways, we act as if when everything is set on the next election, we need to win that assembly, so to speak. We need to win, we need to have
Right.
an advantage over our political opponents.
Yeah, and the degree to which the separate institutions mean anything in terms of checks on each other is certainly degraded by the ideological conformity that we see left and right enforced through various electoral means and other ways. And also, as we talk about things like the end, perhaps, of the filibuster. So if the filibuster goes, then a bare majority in the House and a bare majority in the Senate, combined with a president, can do the most radical things under the sun. I mean, it'd be one thing if we still understood there to be restraints, constitutional restraints on what Congress can do. But we've given that all up. I mean, we no longer really think there's any program that could be unconstitutional if a majority of the House and the Senate and the president are in favor of it. So now, if you get rid of the filibuster, which is very much a possibility, I mean, we've got strong views on the left, but also on the right, many that are pushing in that direction. Then, yeah, I mean, you're much more like just a single assembly in function, even if institutionally you remain divided on paper between those various bodies.
And there are other forces at work, right? The gerrymandering is an
Right.
effort that's taking place that's kind of moving us toward this one single assembly that we fight over. I would say that the national popular vote effort is another example of this,
Hmm.
where we're trying to kind of let's just get it down to whoever has more wins and gets to
Right.
imprint itself upon the other. And I think, as you mentioned, Matt, this is not just a persuasion of the left; it's a persuasion of the left and the right.
Hmm.
And I think it's an indictment on the right to the degree that we go along with this, because if we are on the right, we are politically conservative, and we're trying to conserve that earlier understanding of what representative republicanism was. And I think if we're willing to give up on that, it's just going to be a jungle.
Yeah, I mean the essential problem with a single assembly, as is laid out here in 6 points by Adams, is that that assembly, a bare majority, a momentary bare majority, can do whatever it wants. And all the things you just mentioned are pushing us in that direction. So, national popular vote, right? Bare majority, bare national majority wins the presidency. We want that to correlate with the House and the Senate elections, right? Our system was designed to require you to build a consensus over time to win multiple elections, House, Senate, presidency, staggered terms, Supreme Court, which is lifelong term, designed again for stability. But then if we can change the composition of the Supreme Court at the drop of a hat with a bare majority in the Senate and the House, right? All these things all of a sudden lead us more and more into this immediate direct democracy, which Adams is so much opposed to on wise prudential grounds.
Right? So a government of consent can be degraded and become an empire of men. How about the executive authority? Why is it important that when there's an administration, there are certain offices? And those offices are kind of clear with clear commissions, right, for a governor, for a lieutenant governor, secretary, treasurer, attorney general, that government requires an executive function. But here, Adams is going to add to that an executive function in which that executive is elected annually. So why that understanding of executive authority? Yes, we need someone to execute the law, but we need that annual election as a prohibition against abuse.
Yeah, and he's quite firm on this. I mean, he quotes a proverb of the day where annual elections end, tyranny begins. And it's interesting because, later on in the Federalist, Madison's going to criticize that proverb directly and say, no, that's not really quite right. We have 2-year terms from the House and 6 years in the Senate, 4 years for the president. It's actually better from the standpoint of the stability of society. So I think this is one of those places where, you're in the middle of a transition on thinking where we are in 1776 as Adams is writing here. But of course the goal is to have accountability. The goal is to have a responsiveness to the people so that given their experience, not surprising, under the governors appointed for them by the crown, who weren't at all responsive, who were eager to follow the crown's designs and not really concerned at all for the good of the people, to swing back perhaps too far in the opposite direction and create this rhythm of annual elections that keeps the governor very close to the people, but might, in certain circumstances, make it more difficult for the governor to do things that might be momentarily unpopular that would nevertheless tend toward the common good.
Well, another thing he adds to this discussion, Matt, is the argument for a rotation of all offices. So if you have people rotating in and out of leadership
Hmm.
roles, you're much better off in your governance. But he says that this can only happen and has a great amount of advantages if society has a sufficient number of suitable characters to supply the great number of vacancies. Something that you brought up earlier, that it takes a certain character to rule well. Do we have enough people with that type of character who could be in an executive function, who could rotate in and out of office in a way in which they're not after the office for how it can benefit them, but for how it can benefit society. So here he's going to offer as a guardrail for executive abuse, something that is present within Massachusetts government, New Hampshire state government, an executive council, a
Hmm.
group of 7 to 9 individuals who advise the governor in his executive authority. That kind of, okay, if he wants to appoint people to certain offices, they vote up or down on whether or not that's a good education chair or whatever that it may be, given the various offices within state government. So, I think at the end of the day, as you mentioned, he sees that, having lived through the experience of living under a king, and a king that was not willing to do the right thing with regard to Parliament, we're going to have to put into place some strictures in state government to make sure that our governors don't act as kings.
Yeah, for sure. And the executive council was another one. Didn't really take off as an idea. We have it in those 2 states, and I don't think anywhere else. But yeah, I mean, it's meant to be kind of a pseudo executive body, a pseudo kind of Senate, more elite, smaller body that has an opportunity to sign off on the particular proposals, or in this case, nominations, as you mentioned, of the governor. But yeah, I mean, it's layers of mutual accountability. That's what Adams is looking for. Whether the particular details of this are exactly what we would propose or not, what Adams is trying to show us is that we have to respect human nature, and we need a government that creates systems of accountability to prevent people from abusing their power and that guide them toward the responsible use of that power on behalf of the people.
And then the last branch of government that he gets into is the judiciary. Once again, putting in safeguards here. The judges and all other officers, civil and military, shall be nominated and appointed by the governor with the advice and consent of the council. And unless you want your government more popular, if you do, those officers would be chosen by a ballot of both houses. So in each case, you're beginning to see, right, separation of powers. You're beginning to see
Hmm.
checks and balances at play, in making sure that, okay, you get the right person in the office, but if you don't have the right person in the office, there's something to check that individual, whether it's an election, it's a council, it's the ability for other branches to be able to righten the ship when things have gone wrong. The last thing he's going to touch upon here at the end of his thoughts on government is the idea of commissions. He writes, the dignity and stability of government in all its branches, the morals of the people, and every blessing of society depends so much upon an upright and skillful administration of justice that the judicial power ought to be distinct from both the legislative and executive and independent upon both, that so it may be a check upon both, as both should be checks upon that. The idea of commissioning offices, commissioning here in this case judges, but every office holder has to report to a certain commission. If you're a legislator, right, there's a commission unto you, right, to be a good representative. You're an executive, you've been commissioned, right, to execute the law. If you're a judge, likewise, right, to have a fair and impartial rendering of those things that come before you. But this whole idea of being commissioned to something, I think, is so lost in our day.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think about that in terms of church offices and the solemn ceremonies when a new elder or a new deacon is put into office and ordained and installed, and the various pledges that you make at that point, the affirmations that you make in our church. You have to sign a document, formally sign a document saying you subscribe to the theological standards of the church, and you sign that document right under the names of all the men who have gone before you. And so there's a real sense of the weightiness of that. And you have a certain responsibility. Think about the oaths of office. The presidential oath is right there in the Constitution, and there are parallel oaths for members of the Congress and the judiciary, etc. And it ought to be a solemn ceremony, not just from the standpoint of how it's done, but as you, the office holder or the would-be office holder, take on that oath, to think about the words that you're saying and the obligations that you're taking on and the responsibility of carrying them out.
Yeah, it's, I think once again, I mean, with all the language in this essay, we're so far removed from even thinking about offices in that way, even though we have kind of the routine, right? Okay, we're being commissioned, we have these events that have kind of lost their power as we've kind of undercut forms and we've undercut all of the things that we just think are kind of silly or stupid or they're meaningless. They're
Hmm.
very important, right, for us to rightly think about what we're doing. So at
Yeah.
the end of the essay, he's going to take up some interesting supports, I think, for this type of government. He talks about a militia law requiring all men to be provided with arms and ammunition. And here you think about the Swiss, for example, and the importance of, those men are most free. This is Machiavelli, who are most armed. He then takes up laws for the liberal education of youth, especially of the lower class of people. So education is essential to the proper functioning of government. Of course, we had our situation in the late 1990s in New Hampshire where this was thought that we needed to pass an income tax to pay for that liberal education of youth. Note here, right? New Hampshire Constitution takes up Adams'
Hmm.
authoring of the Massachusetts Constitution. But what does it truly mean to produce a freeing education for young Americans, especially those without means? Essential, right? And you think about how far we've fallen short here. By liberal education, he means an education worthy of free men, and how essential that is to every class of people, not just to those who are well bred, but those who are poor, right? That this is essential. You need to, in order to have a certain character as a people, you need to be educated into your culture and your responsibilities and what your rights are. He writes that no expense for this purpose would be thought extravagant. And Matt, you think here, how much money do we spend on public education in the United States in the year 2026? In particular, I mean, how much money is spent in the state of Massachusetts for just that goal? But do we have 17, 18-year-olds that have received an education between the ages of 5 and 18 that are ready for freedom? People who are willing and able to take up arms if necessary. I mean, I think this is really this passage here in talking about the importance of education is very damning to the America of our age. It's a wake-up call. Like this thing is not going to run into the future simply by having processes that people don't care about at administration in which you fill out your taxes every April 15th, but then you go and do your own thing. And what you care about is the next box that you're going to check off in your own life. Nations don't survive with the people who are not educated to the laws of their nation and a sense as to what a good character is, which leads us to the essential paragraph of the whole essay, which he writes, a constitution founded on these principles introduces knowledge among the people and inspires them with a conscious dignity, becoming free men. A general emulation takes place, which causes good humor, sociability, good manners, and good morals to be general. Wow. I mean, all of those things. A general emulation takes place, which causes good humor. Are we of good humor today? Sociability. Are we of good sociability? Good manners and good morals?
Right. Yeah. And think about what that says. General emulation. It's imitation, right? It's example. It's example both in terms of historical study. I mean, what was this budget going to look like? It's going to look like the study of great deeds and great men of times past. And it's going to be embodied in the people that are in leadership positions of that day. You're going to have a pattern that's you're taught from history, and you're going to have people that are living according to that pattern or not. So, yeah, how is Republican character passed down? What he's saying is it's passed down by imitation, by emulation, by the inspiring examples of those in the past and the inspiring examples of those of the present. And of course, here he is, April 1776. There's a lot of that rightful emulation that's going to take place in this period. Right? You've got George Washington at the head of the troops, chosen in part because he looks the part, because he has the character for the part, not because he was a great general. He was good enough as a general, but as a leader of men worthy of emulation, right? He's at the very top of the heap. And you're going to have this throughout this generation. Those that have learned from history, those have modeled themselves oftentimes on Roman examples, Greek and Roman examples, Christian history as well, interwoven in that, and who then, with that history as their guide, live out that public virtue for all to see. And so the simplest farmer is inspired by that desire to play the man, to act like a free man and to carry on his part in that way. Now, none of this is perfect, but this is a conscious effort that, as you say, Dave, just is entirely absent. All we do is deconstruct the past. All we do is point out the flaws of those who have gone before us from our position of progressive superiority and assume that we're the ones that we're waiting for. And we're pretty good after all. And everyone should emulate us and our keyboard warrior mentality as we get out there on the internet, righting the wrongs of all society. There's no hope in that. And just the opposite of what Adams is saying is really the foundation of a good republic. And there's no substitute for it either, because after a while, as you've been saying, the absence of good morals and good manners and good humor and sociability, institutions can't make up for that. Constitutional documents can't solve that problem if there's not something in human character that can be worked upon as well.
Yeah, and one bright spot in 2026, and I hope it's not a drop in the bucket, has been the tour that former U.S. Senator Ben Sasse has been on. He's at the cusp of death,
Yeah.
right? So, what is worth emulating, right? I think his approach to who we are, what the common good means, what it means to be humane,
Hmm.
it's I think it's been outstanding the last three
Hmm.
or 4 months, and I don't think anyone who sees him with just all the stuff that the chemicals that are going through his body just says, oh yeah, that's not important. I mean, you look at that, and that's honorable. That right?
Hmm.
In dying, he's dying with dignity and directing us back toward these things. But will we take that lead, and will we, who are living, begin to act that way? Not simply when we're on the cusp of death. I'm not saying that's why he's acting that way, but just
Hmm.
live out that and teach that way of doing things to our children and our grandchildren, et cetera. So let's kind of wrap this up, Matt. A couple things that we get for Adams' vision for the state of Massachusetts and what would later be the American Republic. Number one, we know this well from our mentor, Angelo Codevilla, regimes matter, right? The regime you're in, it produces a certain character. And
Hmm.
that character runs through the people, it runs through the institutions of a nation, it runs through the whole body politic. One thing that he says, right, is that we need a regime that produces the most happiness. And I think this is kind of an interesting point here because we want to be happy and we believe that virtue, there's a link between virtue and happiness. There's a danger, however, in happiness, kind of as he defines here, which we'd want to embrace: ease, comfort, security, ease, safety, and freedom. But what happens when we have that ease, comfort, security, safety, and freedom? Do we replenish that needed virtue in order to carry on ease, comfort, and security? I mean, you can look
Right.
through various renderings of regime change in human history where a golden age is followed by a less golden age, which is followed by our dark age, because ease, comfort, and security do not reproduce the virtues necessary for the regime to continue on.
Hmm.
And I think that's what we're talking about here. We're in need of a constant revival of those things that allow for the American regime to carry on. Thirdly, a Republican government is the best regime. It's not monarchy. It's not radical democracy. It allows for this balanced sharing of government between the few and the many. It points people toward the common good. And you can see it at work, not simply in state government or in national government. That Republican virtue that he calls for in this essay is something that, as you've mentioned, can run through families, it can run through churches, it can run through schools, it can run through local associations. So there's an outlet for that Republican virtue in many of the different organizations that we're in. Another thing here, just to summarize this: what's a republic? What's a true republic? A true republic is an empire of laws and not of men. It's not based upon charismatic personalities. It's not based upon the person who can tweet, the best, who can kind of rally their side the best. It's about an individual who knows that their actions are going to have an influence upon others. So, we ought to have a right fear of the unchecked personality,
Hmm.
the individual that wants to make it all about them rather than the republic. And then I think finally, the good republics are characterized by the separation of powers. As we mentioned before, this dangerous movement towards the single assembly mindset in which, in faction, we fight over control over that single assembly, rather than know that it's important, right, that the judiciary act in a certain way, that the executive act in a certain way, that the legislature act in a certain way. And there's going to be disagreement as to what laws are best. There's going to be disagreement as to how those laws are administered or how those laws are judged. But at the end of the day, those offices mean something. They ought to check each other. Right? Ambition does run through human nature, but ambition can counteract ambition, to use Madison's famous line from the Federalist Papers. So all of these things are present within Adams' essay, and it just leads us to beg the question: is there still room for virtue in the American Republic in 2026?
Yeah, I think that's the question that this essay raises. first and foremost, and we've been discussing it as we've gone through it because, you see, I mean, he's not talking about some utopian account of human nature. We're not expecting human beings to always do the ultimate right thing in the ultimate right way for the ultimate right purpose. But he is expecting that if you have good examples and you have good laws and good systems and the basic structure of a well-organized republic, you can have a people that is truly self-governing and that they're able to act with that conscious dignity that is becoming of free men, as he says. And I find that to be a really inspiring kind of vision, that we can have that kind of dignity and see ourselves as those who have to exercise power appropriately. Well, more to be said about that as we move along, and we've got several more weeks and opportunities to reflect upon the institution building side of the United States as it begins to emerge in these early days of 1776. In a couple of weeks, we'll look at the Virginia Declaration of Rights, one of the other documents generated at the state level during this period. But as we wrap up the show for today, let's look at de Tocqueville's crystal ball. We've got to check back in briefly on basketball. So, we've got the Spurs and we've got the Knicks. And Dave, you claim to have picked the Knicks way back in the fall.
I
I
did.
don't deny that, but I don't think we have any record of it on the air. But in any case, neither of us did particularly well. I did pick the Spurs, and so we'll see how they do. But it wasn't our best performance. The PGA will also pass by quickly. Our two choices, Matt Fitzpatrick and Scotty Scheffler, both tied for 14th. So not horrible, but not particularly impressive. And neither of our other picks in terms of club pros or live golfers were particularly good either. So let's try once again with basketball. Now that Wednesday night is game one of the finals. And Dave, tell me your winner, how many games, and who you've got for the MVP.
So I'm going to go with the Spurs to win. I think it's going to take them 7 games. However, I think that the Knicks will find a couple wrinkles. They're well rested here at the beginning of the series that'll allow them to maybe grab one of the 2 games in San Antonio. And then I think maybe win either both at home in a tough place to play, Madison Square Garden. But at the end of the day, the Spurs make it a 7-game series. It's an exciting series. And I'm going to go with a outlier for my MVP pick. I'm going to go with DeAndre Fox, not Wemby, but I imagine everyone would think that Wemby would be the MVP if the Spurs were to win.
Okay, that would be fun. I think the NBA would sign up for that. They would enjoy a nice 7-game series at this stage. The Knicks have been on such a roll. But yeah, I think the question is, are they really the equal of those two Western Conference juggernauts that battled it out for 7 games? And with 3 days between the end of one series and the start of another, I think some of that fatigue is maybe not going to be as big of an issue. Also, just a very young team on the part of the Spurs. So that, inexperience on the one side, but also energy and ability to, get up for the next game. I'll take the Spurs in 6. I say they win it all. They're in MSG, much to the consternation of all the famous people that will gather there for that game. I think Wemby will be the MVP, and who knows? First of 5, first of 6, first of 7. I mean,
Crazy.
22 years old, long way ahead of the Jordan trajectory. So this could be real interesting over the next decade or so.
He's pretty amazing, both his play and his demeanor. So
Absolutely. All right. Well, we'll leave it there for this week. And don't forget to join us next week as we go through these last several episodes in this series, taking us up to July 4th, 2026 and July 4th, 1776. You can also follow us on YouTube and Instagram. Email us at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com. We'll look forward to talking to you again real soon.